Hello, it's the Culture G. Recently, when I watched TV, I heard about how Putin has brought war to the peaceful continent of Europe. I found that statement on TV hilarious, as Europe, if anything, has been more warlike than any other region on Earth in history. What Putin has done is no great exception to European history. It's rather the rule. This is not to justify Putin, but instead to clarify the fact that Europe's history has been very bloody, and this recent period of peace that Europe has experienced recently in a greater historical sense is an exception in history, not a rule. I mean, for example, just look at all the border changes throughout the ages in Europe. Those were not made by peaceful means, most of the time, as there did exist some changes due to marriages, inheritances, selling and buying of land, but mostly it was through war. Borders were determined. And as you see, the changes are a lot, and thus there were a lot of wars behind those changes. This is a lot more than in most regions of the earth, at least in a greater historical sense. If you compare Europe to the Middle East was usually dominated by large empires, not this constellation of small warring states. And the Middle East also had longer periods of stability. And the same can be said of the areas where various Chinese dynasties have dominated. We are seeing long, peaceful periods of several hundred years only interrupted by warfare once a dynasty or large empire falls, due to internal and external pressure. Europe has never had that kind of political stability or peace historically, except in two very unique cases. The first case being the Pax Romana or Roman peace, during the time of the Roman Empire, during the height of their power. During that time, Rome was arguably the world's first true superpower and had a dominance of itself and its surrounding area in Europe that is afforded to few powers throughout history. However, even in this case, there existed exceptions, as it should be remembered that it was still chaotic on the outside of the empire, with various Germanic, Celtic and Slavic groups and tribes constantly battling for local dominance with each other, outside of the Roman borders. So it was definitely not a total peace in Europe. You also have the fact that there was a lot of infighting within the Roman Empire throughout its history, so that also disturbed the peace a lot of the times. But all in all, it was a period of relative peace during the height of the Roman Empire. And it truly deserved the name of Pax Romana, Roman peace. And it would not be until the modern day that we would achieve the same type of peace, or anything approaching it. And that brings us to the second case of peaceful periods. The second case is the modern world after World War II, a world and Europe dominated by two superpowers, USA with the backing of the NATO alliance, and the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact backing it. And then the later total dominance of the USA with NATO, and the building of the European Union. But even in this case, there were a lot of factors which made even this peace not be totally complete. There existed exceptions. It was a peace with a lot of risk of total nuclear war happening in the background. So it's a peace that was always very fragile. There always existed this risk of total annihilation in the foreseeable future. And now with recent happenings we are back there again due to the threat of nuclear war from Russia. It should also not be glossed over that half the continent of Europe was under occupation by the Soviet Union and violent uprisings occurred. The uprisings were crushed, such as the Hungarian uprising of 1956. And also after the fall of the Soviet Union you had conflicts and wars like the Balkan Wars in Europe. So it was not entirely without wars after World War II. One other thing to consider also with regard to the period after World War II is that we also have to remember that this period of peace in European history is also extremely short and could thus just be a fluke, despite politicians trying to avoid war with initiatives like the European Union and closer integration between various parts of Europe in order to avoid war through creating a network of connections between the various countries of Europe that would make waging war extremely costly for any single European country. Alright, so we know that there has been exceptions to this rule of constant conflict, but that still does not answer the question of why has Europe been so violent then, with so many wars and constant conflict and incessant fighting between various factions and political entities. As we are dealing with extremely long periods of history, hundreds to the thousands of years of history, it's important to state that it's unlikely to only be culture or singular political events that are behind this history of constant conflict. This is due to the fact that cultures change, and Europe has been the home to a very wide and diverse range of cultures and political entities. It has hosted a long range of different entities and powers through its history. Thus, it's unlikely that one single culture or single political entity is behind this constant history of war. Thus, the key to answering why Europe has been so bellicose and filled of conflict is probably in the physical, outside of social constructions only. I am of the opinion that the answer probably lies in two physical things. Firstly, the geography of Europe, and the second in the resources available to Europeans throughout history. These are the two main factors for why Europe has been such a conflict-filled continent. Let us begin with the first factor, the geography. When we look at a map of Europe, we can notice that the landscape of Europe is very diverse, with mountains, thick forests, crisscrossing rivers, coastlines, islands, large swampy areas, all dot the landscape of Europe when you look at it in a totality. Europe has a lot of mountain chains. We see this in the Alps, the Iberian mountain range, the Balkans, Scandinavian mountain chain, and the Ural Mountains. There are also a lot of rivers that divide the landmasses of Europe. For example, the Elbe, the Oder, the Tiber, the Rhine, the Donau, the Seine, and so on. And you also have the sea between the mainland of Europe and Europe's various islands, such as Ireland, British Isle, the Danish islands, Sicily and Sardinia, and of course Europe's furthest away island and nation, Iceland. We also have the peninsulas of Europe, such as the Scandinavian peninsula, Jutland, the Italian and Spanish peninsulas, and so on. These various things that I have mentioned represent geographical choke points and barriers, making it hard to invade other parts of Europe and maintain large centralized states, because the logistics are so much harder to maintain and power protection is thus hindered for large political entities. We can, for example, see it even today with how the Dnieper River has stopped or at least hindered a lot of Russian progress in the Ukraine-Russian war. And the physical barriers and geographical barriers were even more of an obstacle in the past, before modern logistics and modern equipment allowed mass transport of supplies. It was much harder in the past to actually move troops, to move them through Europe, where the geography was actively fighting against you, thus favoring local power and defense. Alright, so we have stated now that we have a geography that favors defensive armies and makes it hard to invade other parts of Europe. This is in comparison to China or the Middle East, where power is concentrated along one or a few rivers or other sources of water, and thus centralization and power projection is very easy due to there not existing many natural barriers, as you can pretty much transport all your supplies through one river or across open terrain but does not present many choke points and obstacles for moving armies and logistics. Now we have covered geography. That's the first factor, but what about the second, resources? Well, Europe could be said to have two main resources, and their distribution is also important here. Europe is a very resource-rich continent, especially in metals, which are important for war historically, with metals such as iron, tin and copper. In other words, the metals that are used to create arms and armor. And you can get these metals at several locations in Europe. They have not just been confined to just one mountain range, which means that no one has been able to monopolize these metals completely. Thus, both iron and the other metals have been available to all political entities more or less in European history. But there is also a second resource which is very important for war, and that is the human resources. As Europe has had a historically pretty high population density that is dispersed rather than concentrated only in cities. This dispersed population means that it is not as simple as only dominating the cities and you will have pacified the land. But you still have a rather large amount of people available to wage war. I'm not saying that cities have not been important. Cities have still existed as important population centers and centers of trade. But Europe has had a rather high population that is not concentrated in small urbanized areas, centered around, for example, water resources and the like, due to the fact that water is much more abundant in Europe than it has traditionally been in, for example, the Middle East. It's not concentrated to a few sources of water. So you could add the water availability also as a resource. That is connected to the fact that the population is so dispersed rather than concentrated, at least historically. These two factors of geography and resources creates a situation of an extreme myriad of entities all having political ambitions and the means or resources to pursue war against their neighbors, but being unable to totally dominate the neighbors, and thus this led into a situation of on and off constant conflict between various powers and into a state of almost constant fragmentation of power, as it was easier to protect your own local power in Europe than elsewhere, because it was harder to invade. Thus, it was also easier also to rebel locally, and thus break off. You had a better chance at succeeding in breaking off in Europe than elsewhere, as the centralized power of the kingdom or the empire would have a hard time subduing you, or at least a harder time than it would be in another part of the world. This is also why there has been historically so many smaller city-states and minor powers in Europe in comparison to, for example, Chinese history or the history of the Middle East. You don't see the same sort of city-states as you see in ancient Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. For example, the Greek and Italic city-states during antiquity, or the German and Italian city-states during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. This is because smaller entities in other parts of the world had a harder time surviving the neighbors of getting incorporated in larger empires, because the natural barriers of geography did not exist, or they did not have the resources in the form of metals, for example, to wage defensive wars, because all the metal was concentrated already in the hand of the conquering empire, and thus it was hard to get it from somewhere else. In Europe there were always other sellers you could buy metal from or buy weapons from. Thus, decentralization was favored by the physical factors of Europe. However, the flip side to this is that this has in the past created a lot of various political interests in small political entities that are opposed to each other and thus fed the violence that has historically been ever present in Europe. It's easier to get along among a few people that rule large states than it is to get along with several hundreds of peoples that rule smaller states. Thus, this environment of several political entities constantly being at odds with each other is the background as to why I think Europe has been such a violent place historically. So, pretty much this is the reason as to why Europe has not been a continent of peace but rather of war, at least historically, and why I found the reporter to be hilarious in her report calling Europe a continent of peace, even if Europe has been at peace in the latest decades. The future will determine if that will remain the case, and we will see if Europe will go back to its old state of near constant conflict, or if Europe will become a so-called continent of peace in the future, once the era of Putin is over. Hello, dear viewers and listeners. I thank you for viewing this video, and I would just like to inform you that I'm open for questions and comments in the comment sections if you have any. And also push the like button because it helps with the algorithm. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.